Hello, my name is Andrew Souza. I'm a student with the Colorado Christian University College of Adult and Graduate Studies, majoring in criminal justice. I'm currently enrolled in CRJ 460 Domestic Terrorism, and this is the Session 4 video. This is a follow-up to last week's Session 3 video when I discussed domestic terrorism and lessons learned by local law enforcement when responding to instances or attacks of domestic terrorism. This week I'm going to focus on the recovery phase of a domestic terrorist attack and discuss the lessons learned by local law enforcement when responding to a domestic terrorist attack. So first off, again, we're going to start with the definition of domestic terrorism. The United States Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, defines domestic terrorism as the unlawful use or threatened use of force or violence by a group or individual based and operating entirely within the United States or Puerto Rico without foreign direction committed against persons or property to intimidate or coerce the government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. So examples of this include the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, where an unnamed individual, we won't mention his name to not give him credit, used a rental truck loaded with explosives that he detonated outside of the Oklahoma City building, where he killed a total of 160 people, including 19 children, and injured over 600 more. Other examples of this are the mail packages recently sent out by a Florida man to Democratic leaders containing what appeared to be explosive devices. This meets the definition of domestic terrorism because it's the threatened use of force for political objectives. Another recent example is the October 20th Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, where an anti-Semitic individual shot the worshippers at a Jewish synagogue, killing them. This meets the definition of domestic terrorism because it is the act of violence for social objectives. So obviously, when recovering from a domestic terrorist attack, it's going to be a long, difficult recovery process. There is no solve-all, easy solution to recovering from a domestic terrorist attack. However, I'm going to discuss 3 areas where lessons have been learned by police and ways that we can improve on it. The first area is going to be the relief of police officers. Police officers will most likely be the first responders to a terrorist attack, along with medical. Keeping them rested and prepared for work to respond to a terrorist attack at the best of their abilities is of the utmost importance. The next area that I'm going to talk about is getting accurate information sent out as soon as possible to the residents and hopefully engaging the community in apprehending the domestic terrorists. After a domestic terrorist attack, there's understandably a great deal of confusion and panic and fear that is created by the domestic terrorist attack. A great way to reduce the amount of fear felt by the public is by keeping them informed. When the public is informed, they are also able to help the police in finding and recovering after a terrorist attack. The last area we're going to talk about today is the importance of interagency cooperation and coordination. Following a domestic terrorist attack, there are going to be several agencies involved, being local police, state police, the FBI, Homeland Security, and many others, just to name a few. It's important that these agencies communicate effectively to better handle the situation and help the community recover. Lastly, we'll be discussing all lessons learned and looking at them through the lens of Philippians 2:4, which says, "Let each of you look over not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." The first area we're going to talk about today is relief for law enforcement. Most likely, law enforcement will be the first to respond to the scene, be it city police, county sheriff, or possibly even state police, depending on where the area was affected by the terrorist attack. Depending on the type of terrorist attack, the attack may still be in progress if it's an attack such as a mass shooting. However, if it's an attack such as a bombing or possibly a chemical or biological attack, the terrorist may no longer be at the scene of the attack. Depending on if the terrorist is at the scene of the attack, law enforcement will need to apprehend the terrorist at the scene. However, if the terrorist is not there, then law enforcement will have to work to find the terrorist. When responding to a terrorist attack, law enforcement can be at the scene for several hours or possibly even days without a break between responding to the attack, apprehending the shooter, treating the wounded, processing the crime scene, etc. All of which will take a very high mental toll on the officers from sleep deprivation, stress, and other factors. It's important that agencies realize this stress on the officers and allow the officers time to decompress and time in between the terrorist attacks. Otherwise, it can result in more complicated issues later in life for the law enforcement officer, such as post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, increased risk of obesity, high blood pressure, anxiety attacks, or other sorts of problems. A possible way for addressing this is to have relief officers come in from local jurisdictions or call in off-duty law enforcement to help respond to the scene. By doing this, agencies will allow the officers a chance to get some time off and mental breaks from the attack. Whereas this may not always be feasible, it should be strived for because of the decreased stress on law enforcement officers. However, when calling in other agencies or jurisdictions to work a scene, it'll bring up other issues in communication, such as the sharing of information or processing of vital information, as will be discussed in another area. The next area to discuss when discussing the recovery from a domestic terrorist attack is the information shared with the community. Understandably, following a terrorist attack, there will be mass panic and confusion following a terrorist attack. However, a great way to mitigate this panic and confusion is by keeping the public informed and being honest with them about what's happening. When the public does receive information about the terrorist attack, it's important that it first comes from law enforcement. Making sure that it's coming from law enforcement will mitigate the fear. Imagine if the information was coming from the terrorist cell itself. It would be much more traumatic and much more frightening to the public than if it's coming from law enforcement. Also, not having enough information is very detrimental for the recovery of a terrorist attack. An example of this is from the 9/11 attacks. Immediately following the terrorist attacks, the government and investigating agencies were very slow to allow the release of information and generally responded within its classified attitude and not allowing the public access to information that would help them recover and help prevent panic among the masses of people. A great example of when law enforcement does disseminate information correctly and on time is in the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing, when the police discussed information of the case and kept the public informed via social media. It's important to remember that if people are left to guess, it must be assumed that they will guess wrong. So it's important that you tell them the right information and you tell it to them so they aren't left guessing and perhaps even making up stories about what happened in the terrorist attack. A great way of disseminating this information will be with social media such as Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. The reason being is it allows law enforcement a free way to access the public and speak directly to them without the need for a third-party messenger such as news media outlets. This direct contact with the community will also be beneficial to law enforcement because it will allow community members the opportunity to engage law enforcement and assist directly with efforts to gain information and apprehend the terrorists. Clearly, keeping an open source of communication that's honest and reliable with the public will help the police and other agencies respond to a domestic terrorist attack and mitigate the fear that's felt after a domestic terrorist attack. The last area that will be discussed is interagency cooperation. Following a domestic terrorist attack, there is a lot of work that needs to be done by law enforcement to process the scene and complete all steps necessary in recovery of a terrorist attack. For example, one agency may undertake interviewing potential witnesses in the community. One agency may undertake victim services. One agency may undertake the manhunt for the victims. Other ones may take the processing of evidence and so forth. It's important that while all these tasks are being undertaken, effective communication takes place so information can be exchanged by law enforcement agencies, and it can be used to help, one, prevent more terrorist attacks from happening, and two, catch those who are responsible. However, this is oftentimes more easily said than done. Being in law enforcement myself, I understand that chain of command is a very important aspect of law enforcement, and making sure that you don't break this chain of command is vital. When there are multiple agencies involved, it just gets even more messy because, for example, if I was involved in the terrorist attack and trying to communicate with another officer from a different agency, not only would I have to contact that officer, but I'd have to contact my commanding officers and that individual's commanding officers in passing along information. It's important that we try to create a more streamlined process to effectively exchange the information needed when processing a scene. One way this can be accomplished is by doing drills with law enforcement agencies that work closely together, and possibly even federal or state law enforcement agencies. That way, law enforcement officers and leaders of law enforcement organizations will be better equipped to handle such events if it occurs. This will benefit the law enforcement community because it'll give them a precedent to work off of if such an event were to unfortunately happen, and it would make sure that people are more prepared and will communicate better in the actual event. Similar to training for active shooters, where agencies get together and theorize plans and strategies for example, responding to a school shooting. It's important that agencies also get together and set up some sort of communication network and policies relating to chain of command and sharing of information in the event of a domestic terrorist attack. Today I discussed the recovery phase of a domestic terrorist attack and focused on lessons learned by local law enforcement in response to a domestic terrorist attack. I discussed the definition of domestic terrorism, which is the unlawful use or threatened use of force or violence by a group of individuals based and operating entirely within the United States or Puerto Rico without foreign direction, committed against persons or property to intimidate or coerce the government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. I discussed three topics when recovering from a terrorist attack, the first being relief on police officers. In the immediate recovery and response from a terrorist attack, police officers will be on the scene and work many hours to help process the scene, deal with victims, or manhunt for the perpetrators, or a variety of other tasks that will be important when responding to a terrorist attack. This will understandably take a great toll on them, and it's important that agencies realize that and give them the time off. Ways to still keep staffing pattern may include interagency cooperation and calling in off-duty police officers to assist with the efforts. I discussed the importance of getting accurate information sent out to people as soon as possible immediately following a terrorist attack. After 9/11, this was not done very well, and there was a lot of guess and panic that was done by people. It's important that law enforcement follow what the Boston Police Department did after the Boston Marathon bombing and disseminate information to the public as accurately and as quickly as possible. Last, I discussed the importance of interagency cooperation in processing the crime scene and dealing with the domestic terrorist attack. Last, we're going to look at this through a biblical lens. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 4, it's written, "Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also the interest of others." This is definitely what police officers do and other law enforcement agencies do when responding to a domestic terrorist attack. They don't put themselves first. Instead, they look after the interests of others and protect others. This strikes at the very core of law enforcement, which exists to serve and protect the public. Unfortunately, dealing with domestic terrorist attacks are a part of the duties of modern day law enforcement, and in doing so, they are fulfilling the directive given in Philippians chapter 2, verse 4.